One of the things that I love is that two films idea of your life. And there's like two stories you can tell. One that is safe and full of regret, and one that is risky and full of pride and joy.
I'm sorry I'm not there in person. I'm sure it's lovely. So I spent my career mostly in Silicon Valley, but a little bit in finance. And as a leader, I really struggled. I struggled with a lot of things, but first and foremost, I struggled with what I consider to be the atomic building block of leadership, which is feedback, which is giving both praise and criticism to people in a way they can hear it. And all I really mean by radical candor is caring personally and challenging directly at the same time. That's all I mean by radical candor. And yet, why is such a thing so rare? I've worked with lots and lots of leaders, been a CEO coach, and I've never worked with a single one who said, the reason why I'm going to be a great leader is that I don't give a shit about people. Like, that's not what moves us down on the care personally dimension. So what is it that brings us down on the care personally dimension? I think part of the problem there is we get our first job around the time we're 18, 19, 20 years old. And we're right at the moment in our lives when our egos are maximally fragile and our personas are beginning to solidify. And right at that moment, someone comes along and says, be professional. And I think for a lot of people, that gets translated almost subconsciously to mean leave your humanity, leave your emotions, leave your true identity at home, and show up at work like some kind of robot. And you can't possibly care personally about others if you're showing up at work like some kind of robot. So part of radical candor is about learning how to build real human relationships at work. When you're really lucky, you actually love not only your work, but the people who you work with. But the Beatles got it wrong, I regret to say. Love is not all you need. There's also this other dimension of radical candor, the challenge directly dimension. And this is what I think of as the willing to piss people off dimension of radical candor. And the problem here is much more fundamental. The problem here begins when we're 18 months old, I think. And I don't know if you have the same expression there, but in the United States, parents always tell their children, if you don't have anything nice to say, don't say anything at all. And yeah, some versions get said almost everywhere, I think. And so we are really reluctant to say what we really think. And it's hard to undo training that's been pounded into our heads since we learned to speak. But I would argue if you really care about your colleagues, it's not just your job to say it, it's actually your moral obligation to them to say it. So that's why it's hard. It's hard because of this be professional training that we've had since we were 18 years old. It's hard because of this, if you don't have anything nice to say, don't say anything at all, training that we've had since we were 18 months old. So very early it sets in. So one of the things I've done to make it a little bit easier is to think clearly about what happens when we fail on one dimension or another. So if you do both, it's radical candor. If you manage to challenge directly, but you forget to show you care personally, that's obnoxious aggression. Sometimes when we realize we've been obnoxiously aggressive, when we realize we've been kind of a jerk, rather than moving the right direction on the care personally dimension, we move the wrong direction on the challenge directly dimension. And we kind of utter the false apology and we say it's no big deal, it doesn't really matter. Of course, it is a big deal and it does really matter. And then we're in the worst place of all, manipulative insincerity. And this is where passive aggressive behavior, backstabbing behavior, all the kinds of worst political behavior in the workplace get introduced. And it often happens in that hero's journey from obnoxious aggression to manipulative insincerity that we all have gone on. We've all issued the false apology. And these actually are the things we like to tell stories about at work. Obnoxious aggression, the person who behaved like an asshole, or manipulative insincerity, the sort of political weasel who squirmed his way to the top. But the truth is, that the vast majority of mistakes that we make, the vast majority of the time at work, happen in this last quadrant. When we do show we care personally, and we're so worried about not hurting someone's feelings that we don't challenge them when we should, that we don't tell them something they'd be better off hearing. And that last mistake I call ruinous empathy. So that's radical candor in a nutshell.
And there's a brilliant link straight in there, because I'd like you to tell us your story about Bob. I think everyone's got a Bob story, or everybody's been a Bob. Tell me about Bob.
So this was probably the worst moment of my career. So I had hired this guy, we'll call him Bob, and I liked Bob. He was smart, he was charming, he was funny. He would do stuff like, we were one time at a manager offsite, and we were doing a startup, and everybody was stressed out, and nobody really felt we had time to play this get to know you game that we were playing, but nobody wanted to be the jerk who said, I don't really have time for this. And Bob was the guy who had this is taking a long time, and I can see we're all stressed out. I'd help us get to know each other, and it'll be really fast. If it was really fast, whatever, we were gonna do it. And so Bob says, let's just go around the table and tell each other what candy our parents used when potty training us. Weird, but fast. Weirder yet, we all remembered. And then for the next 10 months, every time there was a tense moment in a meeting, Bob would whip out just the right piece of candy for the right person at the right moment. So it was a little weird, but it added a little levity. We all liked Bob. He was fun to work with. He was a nice spirit on the team. There was one problem with Bob. He was doing terrible work, absolutely terrible work. He would hand stuff into me, and there was shame in his eyes. He knew it was bad. And I was so puzzled. I couldn't understand why this was happening, because he had this incredible resume, this great history of accomplishments. And I learned much later, actually, the problem was that Bob was smoking pot in the bathroom 3 times a day, which maybe explained all that candy. But I didn't know any of that at the time. All I knew was Bob was handing in work that was really not nearly good enough. And so I would say something along the lines of, oh, Bob, this is such a great start. You're so smart. You're so awesome. We all love working with you. Maybe you can just improve it a little bit. And of course he never did. And this goes on, and Bob's colleagues are having to cover for him, and they're getting increasingly frustrated. And so let's pause for a moment here, because this is the mistake that I've seen managers, I've made it myself over and over again, and every manager I've ever worked with has made this mistake of not wanting to hurt somebody's feelings. And the big reason, the major reason that I didn't want to tell Bob the truth was genuine ruinous empathy. I really didn't want to hurt his feelings. I really did like him. But there's also kind of a darker side to the story, if I'm honest with myself. Part of the reason that I didn't want to tell Bob that his work wasn't nearly good enough in terms that were clear enough for him to understand was that Bob was well liked on the team. And also Bob was kind of a sensitive guy. And I was afraid if I said in no uncertain terms how bad his work was, how unacceptable it was, he would get upset. Maybe, God forbid, he would even start to cry. And then everybody would think I was a big you-know-what. And I didn't want that. So part of it, that was the manipulative insincerity part. The part of the reason why I didn't tell him that where I was concerned about my own emotions was manipulative insincerity. But the major reason was that I liked Bob, and I didn't want to hurt his feelings. So this goes on for 10 months, and eventually the inevitable happens. And I realize if I don't fire Bob, I'm going to lose my best employees. I'm going to lose all my best employees, and we can't afford that. And so I finally sit down and have a conversation with Bob that I should have started, frankly, 10 months previously. And I explained to him where things stand. And when I'm finished, he kind of pushes his chair back from the table. He looks me right in the eye and he says, "Why didn't you tell me?" And as that question is going around in my head with no good answer, he looks at me again and he says, "Why didn't anyone tell me? I thought you all cared about me." And now I realize that just trying to be nice, I've wound up firing Bob and not giving him a chance to solve the problem. And I realize that I have made at least 6 different mistakes. The first 2 is that I failed to solicit guidance from Bob. I never asked Bob what was going well from his perspective. I never asked Bob for praise. And more importantly, I never asked Bob for criticism. Maybe I was doing something that was driving poor old Bob so crazy, he was forced to toke up in the bathroom 3 times a day. I don't know, because I never asked him. I never solicited criticism from Bob or praise. So those are the first 2 mistakes. The next 2 mistakes I made were that I never gave Bob praise that was real. The kind of praise I gave him was really just a head fake. "Oh, Bob, you're so smart." It was palaver. And I never told Bob when his work wasn't nearly good enough. So I never gave Bob the kind of criticism that he could act on, where he could fix things. And probably worst of all, the last 2 mistakes I made is that I failed to create the kind of environment in which everyone would tell Bob what was really good about his work, would give Bob real, genuine, helpful praise, specific and sincere. But I also failed to create the kind of environment in which everyone would tell Bob when he was going off the rails in a way that was kind and clear. And because I had made all these different mistakes, I'm now having to fire Bob because of it. Not so nice after all. But I realized even Bob at this point thought he should go, now that he understood where things were. All I could do in the moment, it was too late to save Bob. All I could do in the moment was make myself a very solemn promise that I would never make that mistake again, and that I would do everything in my power to help other managers avoid making that mistake, because it was painful for me, it was worse for Bob, and it was terrible for the whole team. It's such a common mistake, an avoidable one. So that's why I'm here talking to you today, and why I wrote the book, and why I came up with the Radical Candour framework.
Brilliant. Anybody here treated someone like Bob before? Anybody been Bob? So I've got 2 follow-on questions from that. Firstly, is Bob okay?
Yes, Bob has a good job, and he's managed to get his pot habit under control.
And secondly, you talked about the need to create an environment of trust where people could actually express the concerns that you had and they had. How do you do that? How would you make this better next time?
Yeah, so I think there's kind of a catch-22 here, because we often feel like we can't be radically candid until we've built trust. But the way that we build trust is to be radically candid. So the seeds of trust are actually sown in radical candor. And so I think first of all is creating the kind of environment in which people take a simple scenario. Let's imagine you're just getting to know someone and you're having lunch with them for the very first time and they got spinach in their teeth. You know that it's your job to tell them that they have spinach in their teeth. I mean, it's easier to tell an old friend they have spinach in their teeth. But if you don't tell this new acquaintance, this new colleague, they have spinach in their teeth, they're going to go to the bathroom. They're going to see spinach, and they're going to wonder, like, why didn't he or she tell me I have spinach in my teeth? So you've got to do that. It's the same thing with other kinds of work issues. So you've got to say it. So what specifically would I do to start to build that culture of candor on the team, to encourage candor between people? I think there's a couple of things that specific things you can do. One is you create a norm of what I call clean escalation. So one of the biggest mistakes that managers make is, let's say I have 2 people on my team, Andrew and Alan. And Andrew and Alan hate each other. And all I want is for everyone to get along and do their job. Any manager ever been in that situation? And so Andrew comes into my office and starts pouring poison in my ear about Alan. And it's very tempting as the leader to listen. But this is the one and only time as a leader you shouldn't listen. What I should say to Andrew is, have you talked to Alan about this? But it's so tempting to feel like I'm being an empathetic leader or just an empathetic colleague to listen. And then it's tempting to think I'm a shuttle diplomat and not just a boss. And so I run to Alan and say, Alan, if you can just do this, this, and this, you'll get along with Andrew so much better. And I think I'm doing everybody a big favor. I'm not. All I'm doing is stirring the political pot, because now Alan knows that Andrew's been talking to me about him, and now he's really pissed. And now he pours poison in my other ear about Andrew, and now I run back to Andrew and I said, you can just do this, this, and this about Alan. And then Alan walks by and sees the two of us in there, and he thinks, I wonder if they're talking about me. And of course we are. So requiring people to work it out, but also being willing to offer your conflict resolution services. So I say to Alan, have you talked to Andrew? And he says, no. I send Alan off to go talk to Andrew. And then I have to follow up and say, did you two resolve it? How did you resolve it? And probably they didn't even talk, let alone resolve it. And then I got to bring the two of them into my office together. And that's awkward because it feels a little bit like you're a high school principal bringing two kids in. But a big part of Radical Candour is about overcoming social awkwardness. So creating these norms where people know they can't get away with talking badly about their peers to their mutual boss is really important. And that's what I call clean escalation. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I love that. I love that the whole idea of having behavioural norms or understanding where the safe container is within an organisation. Just to help you out there as well, we're all British mainly, so having spinach in our teeth is generally an improvement. It's a good thing. Right, I'm going to open the floor up to any questions in the audience. Anybody got any questions for Kim at all? We've got one at the back there. Thank you.
As you're talking about radical candor and feedback, do you have any secrets for remote teams?
Yes. Remote teams, secrets for remote teams. It's really hard. I have twins who are 10, and I was managing, when I got pregnant, I was managing teams in 13 different countries. And I was talking to my boss about how to travel in this condition. And my boss was like, well, what's more important, those trips or the hearts and lungs of your children? So I'm like, I guess I'm not traveling. So I had to learn a new way, because it's so in-person contact is so important for Radical Candour. So what do you do when you can't be in person? I found a few things are helpful. One is if you can have shorter, more frequent meetings. So instead of a 1 hour one-on-one once a week, have 5-10-minute one-on-ones every day. Makes a huge difference. Or 15 minutes 3 times a week, whatever you can manage, because you want to be able to get sort of a little bit more about the texture of what's going on for the person, which you get with more frequent interaction. So that's important. There's also a hierarchy of mediums. If you can have your calls over video, it's much better. 80% of communication, 85% of communication is nonverbal. And so over video, you can get at least a few of those nonverbal cues. If you absolutely can't do the calls over video, the phone is much better than email, and just never break up over text. So use the technology to your advantage. Also, if you can fly people to you and help them not only build relationships with you, but with each other, I found it really helpful. One of the things I did was, instead of going around to all the 13 different countries, I flew a bunch of people to California, which seemed a little bit excessive and expensive, but the value was enormous of getting everybody together in one place, so that the peer relationships formed. It wasn't all on my shoulders. So that was important. I also think when there's a time zone difference, it can be really helpful to work on the other time zone, even if you aren't in the other time zone. So in other words, I would work 1 week per quarter on UK time, and then 1 week per quarter on Japan time. And that really helped a lot.
Brilliant. That's fabulous. Any more questions?
Make sense?
Yeah, we've got a question here.
Yes. Which do you find the most candid, or actually the least candid? You worked in finance and you worked in Silicon Valley. Which is the most candid and which is the least?
So which is the most challenging, working in Silicon Valley?
Finance or Silicon Valley, which was the most candid?
Oh, Silicon Valley was more candid than finance, actually. I think that the engineering mindset, you can't, if you're building something technical, it's either going to work or it's not going to work. And you can't sort of narrate your way around a product that doesn't turn on when it's supposed to turn on. So I think finance lends itself to narrative, and you wind up with these giant bubbles that are ludicrous on the outside. So I think that I would say it's interesting. In finance, I would say there was more of a culture of obnoxious aggression than there is in tech. In tech, particularly in California in general, there's a real culture of ruinous empathy. So both are problematic. You just got to pick your poison.
But I love the idea that there's more absolutes in Silicon Valley than there is in finance, which is all about numbers.
Yeah, but you can lie with numbers, man. I mean, how do we get these crazy bubbles, which on the surface make no sense, like these swaps, you know?
True.
Like,
No, very true. One more question from the audience. We've got any more? We've got 2 questions. We've got one here. Oh, we've got 3 questions. One here, one there, and then one where Hugh is first.
How do you get over when folks are not very self-aware or really have an inability to be truly honest? Because then it's as if you're not even talking on the same planet.
Yeah. The self-awareness thing is really big. I was working with a venture capitalist, and he wanted me to help one of his colleagues, who every time he would give some feedback to an entrepreneur, the entrepreneur would never want to work with the firm again. So they were having some issues with his. They thought it was really a communication issue. And as I started working with him, it became clear to me that it was actually an arrogance problem. Like the problem was that this guy just thought he was smarter than everybody else. And so everything he said was communicating that, and he wasn't even aware that it was communicating that. So I think radical candor starts with self-awareness, and then you also have to be relationally aware. So radical candor, I say, is it's measured not at the speaker's mouth, but at the listener's ear. And so it's not enough to have good intentions, to be aware of your own good intentions. You also have to be aware of the impact that your words are having on others. So that's important, but it's a skill that can be developed. It's not it's not something that's just innate. There are a lot of different ways to build that self-awareness and relational awareness that don't have to involve sitting on a rock for months and months. I mean, you can doing some sort of improv can be enormously helpful to sort of practice playfully. And so you begin to see and practice in a way where others can tell you the impact that your words are having on them. If someone really can't be honest, that's a harder problem. That's a harder problem to solve. I think usually just helping people see the benefits of being honest with themselves and with others can begin to build the muscle of honesty. But there are people I've met who've been in cultures that are so profoundly dishonest that they just really, it's not that they're dishonest people, they just have not built that muscle, because it's hard to be honest.
When everybody else isn't, agreed. And then we've got a question in the middle here, and then one at the back there.
I've got a quick question about how radical candor has been dealt with in different countries and cultures. There was some interesting research that I saw recently about the level of confrontation and aggression across different countries, and I wonder how that would affect radical candor.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think at one level, radical candor is kind of universally human. If you abstract it up to its highest level, it's about love and truth. And with the exception of this White House in Washington, D.C., love and truth are values that most people hold dear, right? In most cultures. Even most Americans think love and truth are really important. And so at that level, it's universally human. But I think that it's culturally relative. It's also interpersonally relative. So if you're going to be radically candid with me, you're going to have to be further out on the challenge directly dimension, maybe more aggressive. Whereas with my younger sister, who's a better listener and maybe more gentle, you're going to have to work harder on the care personally dimension in order to get through to her. Same thing with cultures. When I managed a team in Tokyo and a team in Tel Aviv at the same time, and radical candor sounds very different in Japan than it does in Israel. In fact, with the team in Tokyo, I called it polite persistence because that was a way that was useful for them. They kind of thought about caring personally was well expressed with politeness, and challenging directly was easier for them to think of as persistence. Whereas in Israel, if I had called it polite persistence, they would have found it a giant waste of time. So I'm not saying that Israelis are rude, but they have a much higher tolerance out on that challenge directly dimension. So you got to make sure you're adjusting for the culture and for the individual.
Love that. And then we've got one final question in the middle. Yeah, hand up there. Thank you. Keith?
You've shared so much great wisdom today. What
You.
is your own wisdom that is hard for you to put into action?
You know, radical candor is very hard for me to put into action, actually. That's why I wrote the book. I was raised in the South in the US. I was born and bred for manipulative insincerity. And so it was the thing that I struggled with most intensely as a manager was really trying to figure out how to tell people what they needed to hear in a way that was also in line with my goal to really be a kind person. And so I think the reason why radical candor was helpful for me, and maybe why it's resonated for other people, is this is a way to be honest and truthful that is also kind. It's kind and clear at the same time. And so one of the ways I think about it is ruinous empathy is a huge problem. I often get paralyzed by my own concern for other people's feelings. And if you contrast that with sort of compassionate candor, then you begin to understand how you can move even further on the direction that you really care about, this care personally dimension, at the same time that you go out on the challenge directly dimension. Does that make sense?
So helpful. Thank you.
Yeah. Kindness is a competitive advantage for certain. I've got one final closing point, and we nearly touched on it there, actually. How do you apply radical candor domestically?
You know, I'm gonna write this book called The House of Radical Candor. It works. It's even easier at home than it is at work. Because like with my husband, it's easy for me to show. I can go up and give him a big hug and a kiss. Like that's not always available to me at work. So but it's more important. You want to lead with care personally, I think, at home. But it's equally as important to challenge directly. Very often I'll give this talk and somebody will come up to me and say, if only I had heard this 5 years ago, I wouldn't be divorced. Somebody else came up and told me the story about how when he first got married, his wife clinked her spoon on her teeth when they ate cereal in the morning. And it bugged him, but he didn't want to be petty and complain about it. And 5 years later, it was driving him crazy. And like one morning she woke up and clinked her tooth that last time. And he said, I need a divorce. So I'm sure there were other things going wrong in the marriage than the clinking of the tooth. But
I think toast is an option at that point, isn't it?
Yeah. So it's even more important, I think, at home than at work to tell the people who you love when they're doing something that is harmful to your partnership or to the relationship.
Brilliant. Kim, insightful, obvious, yet completely ignored. Thank you so much for writing the book. Thank you so much for being involved. There you go. Have an amazing day in California. We've got a great evening in California lined up. Thank you.
All right. Good. Go eat that grilled lamb.
Cheers.